Tonight, our guest is Tollef Olson. Has anybody met Tollef before? Okay, well, this is going to be good. You won't find a more energetic or passionate speaker. And Tollef comes from a commercial fishing background, as well as, like, you've done treasure hunting too?
Restaurant.
And restaurant. So a pretty diverse background. I remember when I started the job, it was just the time when mussel rafting had started within the state. Tollef was right there at that forefront. He founded the company whose brand is Bangs Island Mussels. And we heard from Matt Moretti earlier, so Tollef is the founder of that company. He founded Ocean Approved, which was the first kelp farm in the United States, I think. Yes. Yep. And his company, presently he's co-founded, is Ocean's Balance. And he's going to talk with us about production of seaweeds. But in case you don't touch on it, Tollef, I want you to make sure that you ask him about food. Because every time I hear Tollef talk, there's a new spectacular picture of some way to use seaweeds and seafood together. And I've just always been impressed with you experimenting in the kitchen. And it sounds like a delicious place to be. So Tollef, please.
Hi, I'm Tollef Olson, as Dana said, a real diverse background. I've commercial fished on and off all my life in a lot of fisheries. From Maine, moved to Florida with my family in 1970 and fished Florida, fished the Gulf of Mexico. Also spent a lot of time all around the world doing marine salvage, treasure hunter, looking for old shipwrecks. Actually met with a little bit of success. And then I actually owned a restaurant for a while up in Bar Harbor. So combining those three elements, I became a perfect candidate for aquaculture. You've got to be innovative. You've got to come up with new foods if you're first in. When I first started with the Bangs Island mussels, I couldn't sell them, and I couldn't sell them all for the price that they should sell at. Now they can't grow enough rope-grown mussels in Maine. I don't think any company can keep up with the demand right now. Seaweed was even a little further behind. I started talking to Chef Earhart from Maine Coast Sea Vegetables as early as 81, 82, when I had the restaurant, about doing something with seaweed. And the demographics just weren't there. We were just starting to get sushi bars in the United States. People were just starting to think about seaweed. But other than the vegetarians and the macrobiotics, it really was not a staple in anyone's diet. The only really big company at that time was FMC, who pull out the carrageenans. And they opened up, I think it was 1934 that they started, and through 1970, they harvested all their seaweeds right up here in Maine, Nova Scotia, and even down to Massachusetts. Well, in 1970, they moved it offshore, and they started farming down in the Philippines and created 1 million jobs. Where I'm going with this, of course, is that now we're finally seeing the full circle, and we're actually being able to bring some of these jobs back here and grow a lot of these products here. There was a lot of groundwork that had to be done first. When I started the mussels and then the seaweed company, I couldn't go to the mussel farming store. I had to look at stuff from Europe. I had to look at stuff from New Zealand. I had to look at stuff from all over the world, and then find out something and combine it and make it work here. Seaweed was kind of the same thing. They're farming seaweed on a major scale in China already. They're doing 15 million metric tons a year in China. They pretty much control the industry right now. Probably 97, 98% of the overall kelp food market comes out of China. They grow that much. I see a lot of reasons for doing that here at home instead. We know what's in our waters. If you Google where they farm the seaweed in China, it would be like putting it right in New York Harbor, or right in one of the dirtiest harbors you could find in the United States. Luckily, seaweed, like a lot of other farmed things, it can uptake the heavy metals, but in general it doesn't collect the baddies. It's no different. A lot of the fertilizer running downhill is just food. It's just a plant. It's growing from the sunshine and from the nutrients, which are just nitrogen, like we'd actually put on a real crop or a regular crop. But so we've got the unique topography here with 3,000 miles of coastline and a lot of the fishing fleet that actually sits idle in the wintertime. I know it seems funny now. When I started talking about this a decade or more ago, we were desperate for jobs. Right now, the job market is totally saturated, but that doesn't mean the job market at home is saturated. We have all these outlying communities, and I can't help but imagine several of you live in those. And if you want a job in your community, then you do have to find it, and you do have to go to the ocean. The alternative is to move someplace else to find a job, and that's not an alternative that all of us want. When you get into aquaculture, The first couple things you have to worry about is location, where your site is going to be, but you also have to have a seed source, and that's the first thing they're going to ask you. Some of you are already farming, I guess, and a lot of you are doing wild, but the first thing the DMR is going to want to know is seed source. The first thing I did with Ocean's Balance when we moved into and started the first farm here in the United States of seaweed for human consumption was to develop the seed technology. We actually got to the point where we could take the wild source tissue, which is a reproductive tissue, induce it to release the spores on demand in a lab, and hold it in controlled conditions for a month with light, food, and temperature before we move it out into the ocean where it does its thing all by itself. The entire eastern seaboard of the United States is considered nitrogen impaired. Nitrogen is the fertilizer we put on our crops. We've got plenty out there. I was out harvesting seaweed on a bed one day, and the warden pulls up and he goes, "What are you doing?" I was harvesting rockweed, and I was harvesting it on a smaller scale, and you'll see later on that part of what I do is experiment with new food products. But I looked at him and smiled and said, "Hey, we're recycling the fertilizer that these guys dumped on that lawn up there." Looks over at this big green expanse of lawn, and he goes, "Oh, could you explain that?" We're taking up the nitrogen that's running off. And so the seaweed farming is really a win-win-win. It's a fairly low cost to get started in. It's fairly simple to get the seed right now. There are sources. Individuals probably wouldn't want to all start their seed farms. This is actually sugar kelp, and this is what is the dominant crop being farmed right now. We have started farming a variant of this, which is ribbon kelp or skinny kelp. It really doesn't even have a name yet. They're very closely related, and they grow in the exact same conditions on the farm, so they're both real good crops. Putting them in the ocean is real simple. After we get the spores to release, we put this piece of PVC with a couple 100 feet of string on it into a dark tube, settling tube overnight, and the spores actually swim to the string and then adhere to the substrate. It was funny, the first time that we got our spores to release, we were at the lab down in GMRI working under a grant, and our spores started swimming away under the microscope. Now, I'm not a scientist, and I'm looking at these spores going, I'm growing a plant. How can these spores be swimming? And there's three, the laminaria species or strain of kelps, the spores all swim, they're mobile, and so they can actually go to a preferable substrate. It is different with some of the other kelps like the fucoids, and we'll get into that later. But so after you've held it for a month or so under ideal conditions in the lab, you see how nice and even the brown is on that string. You just you throw your mooring in the water, you attach to the mooring, you line to the mooring, and with the string tied through it and the line going through the piece of PVC, you just back down in the boat and the string spirals out around that line. I can seed a 400-foot LPA in about 20 minutes. That includes dropping the moorings. And I'm going to get into the moorings in a minute because that was became a big issue in the early stages. This is what it looks like after 4 or 5 or 6 months. The amount of volume we can grow in a winter is unbelievable. We see gross weights of up to 10 pounds a foot. It can vary from place to place, and everybody gets excited when they hear 10 pounds a foot, but that includes everything. You're talking the hold fast, you're talking the stipes, the blades, and a lot of times out on the very tips, you'll have reproductive tissue or less than prime tissue. And that can make a big difference on the quality of the kelp. So you don't yield necessarily 10 pounds of perfect food kelp. 3 or 4 pounds a foot would be probably more average yield at this point. And the aftermarket or the secondary buying market right now is the price is $1 a pound. So there's actually a pretty good price going for them. Even at 3 or 4 pounds a foot, you're going to see a good return on your farms even in the first year. This is what you can grow in about 7 months. That piece of kelp is about 15 feet long. And all we did was put the rig in the water and let it grow. That young lady and I, Colleen, on this barge one day, harvested 16,000 pounds, just the two of us. That was actually part of a fuel experiment that we were doing with BAL Labs, DuPont, and Statoil under an ARPA grant. And so we were growing it strictly for the volume, that particular farm. But two of us on this little bitty barge with just 2 davvies and hand crank old trailer winch like you'd use, were able to harvest that much. And so the volume's there. We know we have plenty of beautiful places, and this is actually a good time to talk about that a little bit. Getting the sites is a key issue, and you see the shoreline back here. This site is placed well out of all navigational areas, You all know, if you work on the water, that some areas are more heavily fished for lobster than others. So that's one of the first things you're going to do is go look and try to avoid a heavily lobstered area. You're not going to get that lease anyways, unless it's a strictly seasonal area, which there are plenty of. And with the lemon areas, that's part of the beauty of it. It is counter-cyclical to the lobster industry, which for this particular crop opens up a lot of coastline. And it also opens up coastline that's close to home, which wintertime travel on the water, especially if you're working with light gear, can really be can be difficult and can be dangerous. The real key when I put that first farm in was to develop new product lines. I love dried seaweed, but as a chef, I've even been guilty of having it in the cupboard and, well, it doesn't fit what I'm cooking tonight. So I came up with the idea of fresh frozen. Just simply blanch it, freeze it, think Charlie's Bird's Eye, and away you go. You've got a whole new product line. And that opened up a lot of doors. This was back 2008, 2009. I actually put the first wild product of that type on the market in 2002, 2003, and it was that long before I was able really to control my farming conditions and actually have a farm crop like this that we could then move into that stream of raw materials. And so even though we had a beautiful product, you still have to get the market used to it, and people don't know what it is. Little things that you don't think of at first when you're introducing a new product. Do you put it with the fish, or do you put it with the frozen veggies? You put it with the frozen veggies and you've got the most expensive product on the shelf. You put it with the frozen fish, well, the price point is real good, but you just lost all your vegetarians and macrobiotics. They aren't going over there to buy it. And that's a big segment of your market. These are little things you might not think about initially when you're ramping up. And on the ramp up, that's why it's good to have an off-taking, or a company that will off-take. Then you can play around locally with new products if you like. You can make pickles out of kelp. You can make so many things out of the seaweed, so many different dishes. It's ridiculous. Things like lobster Benedict. You can put we have a kelp puree you put in the hollandaise sauce, and the little rounds on top of there, those are just a blanched stipes. The stipes are actually still underutilized. When I talked about not getting paid necessarily 10 pounds a foot, the stipes actually can run as much as 1 or 2 pounds a foot, and that adds up. And so we're working on marketable products with the stipes. And we love thinking outside of the box. When people are sitting there at brunch and you show them an Eggs Benedict, the last thing they're expecting in it is seaweed in this country, but that's starting to change. Another key aspect to seaweed is, you can see there's not a ton of seaweed there. You don't need a ton of seaweed each sitting. It's really dense, it's really nutritious, it's really high in fiber. The dietary fat, and I'll save that for the desserts, there's a good story about the dietary, the fiber and fat. But the trick is to learn how to eat it the way they have in Asia for millennia, the way they have in Europe for millennia and centuries, and then start incorporating it on a regular basis in your diet by getting it into dishes you're already comfortable with using. And that's what we did with the frozen. Who doesn't like a nice smoothie? And you want to talk about an easy way to get it into your kids' diets. But when you get it into your kids' diet, the first thing you're boosting is iodine, which we are all, or not all of us, but 50% of the people in this country are iodine deficient. Very little of our food provides the iodine you need. And so this is a great source of it. With the talk here, I'm just going to be giving a real general overview. It'll last about a half hour, and then on any of these issues or different facets of it, we can go into detail, whether it be the nutrition, whether it be the growing, the nursery. We can move into all of that after we finish the talk. Seaweed salad. The seaweed salad that people have been eating in this country now for the last 3 decades in sushi bars, most of it's crap. It's got preservatives in it. It's got food colorings in it. It's mostly a filler. That it's made actually from seaweed powder, agar, but they roll it out like Jell-O, put food coloring in it, just like the Jell-O we had when we were kids, or on those not too many hospital stays. But that's what the seaweed salad you get in most sushi bars are. This is what a seaweed salad should look. This has 3 kinds of seaweed in it and seaweed in the dressing. It's an Irish-themed dressing. It's simple, and you can make it with any medley of vegetables, and you add such a pop of nutrition. Underutilized species. I think probably everybody has noticed the last few years we can actually dip squids off the docks under the lights. That still amazes me. The first time I saw them dipping squids under the lights like that was in Manila Bay in the Philippines, and I didn't think I'd see the day when we'd be dipping them up here. But using it with underutilized species in farming. There's 2 things here. I'm using an underutilized species, 2 of them actually if you include the cranberry. And also, that's a juvenile squid, juvenile kelp off of one of the farms. And in the wild, you wouldn't want to try to harvest wild beds, harvesting the juveniles. You just wouldn't get enough biomass from it. But on the farms, you actually get better growth if you go out and pick what are some really prime small vegetables, like the baby spinaches that you see in the grocery store that they charge twice as much for. Dessert. First thing you think of when you think about seaweed, right? We make a puree that goes into batters like this that gives a nice little umami pop hidden in the background, and it adds the nutrition. And this is where I'll mention to talk about the dietary fiber. Two separate studies, both preliminary studies, but one in Great Britain and one in Japan, have concluded that the marine fiber in seaweed is 75% more efficient at removing bad fat. So we're talking about some guilt-free dessert here. That we're going to be able to sell. And actually, we already are. We make a fudge now that we do at shows, and people just, that's seaweed? That's not seaweed. I've gone to down to Johnson & Wales probably a couple times. Johnson & Wales University, they invite me down to their food labs and to teach classes and do this down there. And the kids down there are amazing. And this is one of the places I go to help work up new ideas when I run out of ideas for food. Part of the beauty of this is working under the CNET, EPSCoR, Sea Grant, and all these different programs. I've been really fortunate to work with a lot of college level students who are really getting interested in this. The next iteration of this, what we're going to see with the next go round with the seaweeds, is going to be incredible. And this is part of it right here that I absolutely love. This is Long Island in Casco Bay. This year we put this farm in for the kids the third year in a row. It's just a little miniature farm for the grade school kids, and this is the third year in a row that we've run this farm. Now, talk about getting it into the future. When I was in grade school, they certainly didn't teach me this. And they didn't take me out on a boat and show me a seaweed farm, and they didn't let us grow a seaweed farm all winter and then eat it. They just harvested last week, and they'll be having seaweed all week this week. This one I like a lot too, because this is Seaweed Island, and they only ran their farm 1 year. They just didn't have it just wasn't as practical in their location where their farm is. But Seaweed Island is where I put the first Bangs Island mussel rafts in, and there was a lot of opposition to aquaculture. There still is opposition to aquaculture, and that's part of what I mentioned earlier about site selection being so important when you go for sites. And one of the advantages of people putting sites in closer to home, you know the people, you know everybody else out there that's fishing. When I go out in Casco Bay, I know the boats, even in a crowded harbor like that. It makes it easier to get the right sites. But this is Seaweed Island, and now there's aquaculture all around the island and a lot less opposition. As a matter of fact, the islanders have started jumping in, which was the whole idea from the first place. This isn't actually a seaweed farm, this is an oyster farm, and we just put a little patch in for the kids. Now the next thing that we're going to have to do is look for more species, improve our rigs, work on the functionality of it. These little plow anchors at 66 pounds apiece are easy to handle. You can handle them in a small boat. Somebody mentioned earlier you had a 21-foot boat. I'm running my LPAs out of an 18-foot boat right now and don't even have to take the barge out most of the time. I've got one little section of LPA left that I'll harvest Thursday morning, and all I've got to do is pull up two 66-pound plow anchors, the rest of the material, and go home. When I set up the first seaweed farm in the U.S. for food, I was working under two constrictions. I had a NOAA SBIR grant, and I was working under that contract with BAL Labs doing the fuel study that I mentioned earlier. And as a small startup business, I could not afford to fail because there were penalties if you failed. So I put in 2,000-pound blocks. On one side, I put in 39 of them. Well, these weren't going anyplace, and they didn't. So we succeeded for the grant. But in the succeeding years, having to care for that. It's too big to pull up with a small boat. It's too expensive to get a barge out there. So you really end up relying on putting a diver down every year. And the gear stays in the water year round. It wears out faster. It could interfere or be in people's way a little bit at least. This is my portable farm. And if you're going to grow the laminarias in the wintertime or any other species that has a fairly short growing period, these portable farms are absolutely fantastic. You put them in, you take them out. I've had one in a unit with the University of New England for 3 years now. This was our third year. Grows beautifully, and I've been fishing 4 LPAs of my own now with 2 seasons on them, and I'm really happy with the design. It's a very simple tackle to rig, and it's very easy to deploy it. This is why I can put out an LPA in 20 minutes, a 400-foot LPA. You just drop the anchor, you run up to your first buoy line, you run the line through the tube that you saw tie it off and just back it down, and it's really nothing to it. So we've made it a lot easier to rig our farms now, and a lot less expensive. When I put those 39 2,000-pound blocks out, well, I had to go hire Dan and his big truck to get them from Auburn Concrete to the dock, and then I had to hire Jim's barge, and we put all 39 of them on the barge, which Jim had just built, but he hadn't powered yet. So Colleen and I kicked over all 39 of those 2,000-pounders with a chain fall and little sacrificial line. This is a much easier system to work with. New products. This is, with the last company, Ocean Approved, I created that line of blanched fresh products, fresh frozen, and it culminated with a smoothie cube, a puree. And the frozen, like the dried, are very good products, but some people still get them lost in the freezer a little bit. So I came up with the idea of what would people have in front of them all the time so they'd really start using it on a regular basis like they need to, and that's kelp puree. It's shelf stable. All of a sudden, I don't have to worry about where it is in the grocery store because I don't have to worry about refrigeration or freezing. All of a sudden, I can put this right over with the dried seaweeds where people have been looking for seaweed forever. These are the little things that you pay a lot of dues to learn and figure out. And this product is going great guns. It's refrigerated after open. So it's sitting right there with your mayonnaise, one of the many things it mixes well with. You can mix it in with any sauce that you like. You can mix it into the desserts you've seen. Product innovation is one of the keys to this, and that's something I've been as big on as designing farms, is actually coming up with new product lines and ways to eat it. Ways to eat it that you don't have to change the way you cook. You don't think, well, I'm not having sushi tonight, I can't have seaweed. It's like, hey, I'm having my favorite white clam sauce over pasta. Woohoo! I'm having a cup of hot tomato soup for lunch. It goes in beautifully. So it's a really easy, effortless way to add it to your diet on a regular basis. And that's where the health benefits come in. But also, if we're going to see the socioeconomic benefits of this, we got to be able to sell it. There's no sense farming it if we can't sell it. Product diversification. This is fucus. Most people in the United States, very few people in the United States eat fucus. Guess what? It's real popular in Europe. And it's absolutely delicious. This is actually in its reproductive stage, which is why I've taken these pictures. I've actually been working with propagating this. There are some questions. Bob Vardis did a bunch of studies with the fucoids early on, and supposedly they're real slow growing. But I don't know what slow growing compared to what might be. If you really just want the beautiful, sweet little tips, well, you know what? Slow growing might be okay. If it takes ASCO 3 years to get this big, and you only need it this big, well, hey, maybe you can get there in 6 or 8 months. The other thing this gives is a year-round source of raw material, which is a huge advantage. With the seasonality of the sugar kelps that we're farming now, you've got to get everything done in a 2 or 3 month window. So we're working on expanding that window. And we're not working just with the fucoids. We're working with reds and we're working with some greens also. This is dulse, and we've been playing with farming dulse in several different methods and different styles. And we're working with, trying to work a little bit with nori right now. That's the product they make the sheets out of for the sushi bars, porphyra, laver. And so we're doing a lot of work in the lab still. It's not over. I work a lot with the University of New England. I work with Bigelow Labs, and I kind of get a chuckle out of it because I'm a high school dropout and here I'm hobnobbing with all these PhDs, and they've taught me a lot. And we're really making some really good progress on things like porphyra seed, on the getting the dulse started. And so, with the ultimate goal being a more diversified product lines, but also with having raw materials available year-round, because the other bottleneck that we get into is production facilities, and there are only so many production facilities in Maine right now, and that drives what you're going to get for your product. The more demand there is, the higher the price is going to be. Site selection is just everything, and if you're working in your home waters, of course, you have an advantage to start with right away. You already know, you're out there year-round. You know who's where, you know what they're fishing, how they're fishing it, when the gear moves, where the gear moves. You also know things, you want to look at currents. One of the things I was taught early on when I started into aquaculture in the 90s was look for a place in the wild where it grows good if you're going to grow something. You want to talk about a great indicator. It's not rocket science. The whole procedure at the DMR can be a little bit daunting, getting going with that first lease or two on the applications. The LPAs have made that easier because the LPAs are fairly simple, and then you get your feet wet and you got a feel for it. When you start going for a 4-year experimental, it starts to be quite a bit of data that you have to gather up, and you've really got to have it together, cross the T's and dot the I's, because I tell you, they will send it back every time there's a single I that hasn't been dotted. That said, after you get the first couple under your belt, you get a better feel for it, and it also, after a couple of hearings, you start learning to kind of adjust if you need to a little bit, whether it be where your sights are, what your gear appears like on the surface. There's several different things that become apparent after you've gotten the first couple in, and that's where the LPAs are nice. They're not too expensive to apply for. You can get them in real time. It can take 6 months to a year to get a 4-year experimental lease, they say, which it's a year plus most of the time. It can take up to 2 years to get a 10-year lease. Yeah, that's a long time in a business plan to go, okay, I'm going to put my farm in 2 years, 2 years before crop. That is one of the other beauties of seaweed, is you have crop fairly quick. As in baby spinach, the little juveniles are delicious. You're not going to get the mass, the bulky one out of them, but there is actually some marketable stuff fairly early if you want to take that route. Working with the scientists, we're working on everything from water quality to water clarity, current studies, trying to put this all together. Not all sites grow seaweed the same. I put in 4 farms that are within sight of each other, and 2 of them are fairly close together and grow almost identical. The other 2 grow quite different, and these are all within 2 miles of each other, and by line of sight you can see all of them. One of the ones I thought was going to grow the biggest, the fastest, grew the slowest. It was in a real high nitrogen area. I'm on the board of directors with the Friends of Casco Bay, and we've been mapping nitrogen data in Casco Bay forever. And I went, hey, look at this hot spot, man, a lot of food there. I'll try it there. And something, I don't know if it was the fresh water lens because it was close to the Presumpskit. I don't know if the current's a little bit lighter there. We're going to have to do some more studies, but I didn't get the growth I expected. Early studies or early practice. Now, remember I mentioned earlier with the seaweed you saw on the first farm, the spores swim. Well, guess what? These don't. These sink. So now you can't put them in the dark settling tube like I've done in the past. You got to figure out a whole new way to get them to go to a substrate, which nobody's ever done because nobody's ever farmed them. I did get them to go to the substrate. I have gotten them onto a substrate now, which is the string that you put in the ocean then. But I haven't got it to the point where they're consistent yet. We'll be working on that right through the summer again. But this is something that could be grown year-round. And so that gives you a whole different set of criteria when you go looking for a lease space. If you know it's going to be in year-round, well, that's different than putting one in for 6 or 7 months. With the laminarias, we can get away with putting them out in October and pulling them in May and having up to 10 pounds a foot. Machinery. I won't tell you what this machinery is. Some of you might know what it is, but you can't run down to the restaurant supply store. I was in one today and say, hey man, I need some new seaweed cutters. And seaweed doesn't cut easy, and all of them have different taxonomy, shapes, weights, sizes, viscosities, and so what will cut one seaweed won't cut another. Some of the things I've used are absolutely ridiculous. When I first started my first frozen seaweed product, it was kelp noodles cut right out of the middle of a nice beautiful sheet of laminaria, and I was using a little hand crank pasta cutter. Then I went big time, got a motor for that, and I got up to 3 pounds an hour at that point. I had a guy doing some welding for me, and he walked into the shop one day and he went, you're not going to make any money. Not going to happen. Then I got 2 Italian ones. Man, these were big cutters. They were really cool. Oh boy, guess what? European currents and voltages are different than ours. About $4 transformers later, we had those things running beautifully. And so it's not always easy. But to me, that's a lot of the fun of it, is the development side of it, and then watching the new products at market. This is at a friend of mine's restaurant in South Portland, the Bridgeway. Just a classic fried haddock, French fries, coleslaw. See that green tint on the haddock? That's that kelp puree. And so all of a sudden you've added some umami pop, some nice flavor. We all like fried stuff, but everybody tells us too much fat. 75% more efficient at removing the bad fat. So it's not a silver bullet, but it's a step in the right direction. And then you can even go to dessert. Works great in carrot cake. You can use the puree in the batter, or you can shred kelp in about 50% with the carrot. There's a whole bunch of different ways to add it in and have a lot of fun with it. But one thing to remember, if you're going to be a kelp farmer, at least the kelps we're farming now, it is cold in the wintertime. Yeah, and that's it. I think we'll keep the talk, but like I say, it's a small enough group here that I'm willing to field any questions on any aspect of the things I've talked about. The last year or two, there's some new players on the scene. When I first started, when I put the first farm in the U.S. in, nobody was buying seaweed, fresh seaweed, because there wasn't any. Now there's a bunch of farms, and so people are starting to step into it. My company is a possible buyer. My old company is a possible buyer. There's a new company, Sea Greens, around that's a possible buyer. So there are off-takers now, way more than there used to be. The salinity, I'm wondering if the freshwater lens could retard it a little bit. And so you might not want to be in a place with a huge freshwater lens. That's something we really have just run into. The nitrogen, we find it actually goes to an average of about 30 parts per million, quicker than you think about. The really nitrogen impaired areas will run up as high as 50 parts per million. And so one of the things I look for, and nitrogen isn't what's in the DMR testing for pollutants, but it can be an indicator. I work in areas that are shellfish open, which isn't required for seaweed, but it's also a good selling point. The currents, you want a moderate to fairly strong current. If the current's too light, there's still seaweeds you can do, and there's ways you can get around it, like Peter Fisher and Seth's farm over in the Sheepscot. Some of their area isn't as doesn't have as much current, and some of it's probably being shadowed from their other products, and it gets dusty. It gets, I forget what they're called, but it's diatoms on it. But they've actually figured out they found out that by taking a fire hose to it, they're fine. They can put a big pump on it, and they're fine harvesting it still. I like areas where Mother Nature does some of that for me. My newest site that I'm hoping to get this summer, 4-acre site, has it would be on the upper side of the current that you would want. Well, that's the beauty of the farm seaweed with the predation, because you're keeping it up off the bottom. You're not getting any hitchhikers. What does happen is you'll get settlement and recruitment along your headline. Sea urchins, snails. They look like little periwinkles, but there's actually a kelp-eating snail. And what they'll do at their spat, well, it's free-floating phytoplankton, will settle on your lines. But the beauty of it is if you're putting your line in between August and November and hauling it out by the end of May, they're just getting started, and you'll see when the snails start eating their way down the stipes, and you want to get your product out real quick then, because once they get down on the blades. If the current's too low, or in some water areas, you'll have more other kinds of fouling. By the end of the seasons, you'll have bryozoans and several other things that will start growing on there, and site location can make a difference on how bad that fouling is or isn't. But all of the laminarias tend to get fouled as they spore out in the spring, and as the critters start growing on them. Alaria, which is the equivalent of wakame, sugar kelp, which is the Saccharina latissima, and then what I call the ribbon kelp, or the skinny kelp. I call it skinny kelp. That's a variant of sugar kelp that they have just recently figured out is not the same genetic makeup. It was always assumed it was, but right now the commercial seed available for all of those right now, and all the technology from the farm to the buyer is all right there and available. It would be, you'd want to, you could come to me and say, hey, I need some seed. I'm going to put this much in. And so you would contract with myself. Sarah Redmond is selling organic seed, I believe. And then I think my old company might be selling seed, but I'm not sure on that. And so right now there's 3 labs that I know of that have seed that they're selling. Well, it was originally, it was 200 a spool, which was, and the spools have 200 feet, and we brought it down now to $1 a spool. But what a lot of people will do is, say you want to put some farms in, I might be willing to sell you the seed cheap, or even give you the seed cheap for a commitment of, say, 70% of your crop at a certain price or something. Yeah, and so there's a lot of room for latitude there, and I'm not trying to be wishy-washy on this. This is also brand new, that we haven't written any of this in stone yet. We're kind of making it up as we go, and so we've got to make it to where it works for everybody, because if it doesn't work for both sides, it's not worth doing. Right now, I'm telling people, for the sake of argument, just because the biggest buyer, Sea Greens, has seen a lot of variation in farms, once again, like I mentioned earlier, even in Casco Bay in a distance of 2 miles. And so The average gross weight on the lines is 5 to 10 pounds a foot, but that's everything. The whole fast, the stipe. They're seeing yields of like 3 to 5 pounds a foot. I think it's going to be a little better than that for a lot of people as they get going. And also, when you harvest it, how you harvest it, all that can make a difference. And so at 3 to 5 pounds a foot, let's just go with the difference, go with the 4. On a 400-foot line, that's $1,600, and it costs $500 to $800 to put that in. An LPA is the 400 feet. I actually helped John Lewis and Louise Churchill write the law on that, because when they first put in the LPAs, they didn't include seaweed because there were no seaweed farmers. And so I actually went in and we changed that. And so each LPA, and so you're allowed personally 4. And up to 12, like say with your wife and a child or with 2 friends, you're allowed to manage or tend. One person can tend up to 12. So you can actually, with the LPAs, get a jump start in a way that makes sense, so that while you're waiting for your 4-acre experimental and the longer term 10-year, you can actually build into it and then just keep expanding your equipment. People have played with it a little bit. You don't get, in most cases, you don't get steady enough recruitment, and it's just slower. You know, it's so easy to generate seed and have a real consistent line. And if you're going to go through the expense of having that in the water, it's really nice to have a very consistent growth that you can count on and give you a more reliable finish at the end of the year. Natural set can vary from year to year. It can vary from place to place. And so it can be done. One of the things that got me really going on seaweed was, for years, I live in South Portland, is the boat ramp there. They put the ramps in May. They come out in November after the first good nor'easter, and every year there was this beautiful little crop of kelp on there. And so that was all naturally seeded. And so it can, but it was mixed in with other stuff. It's not nearly as big as the stuff that I farm, that I put in an ideal location. And so if you could find a place where, like they've done with the scallops a little bit, there's places where you can put scallop nets out and they'll catch a lot of spat. And there's other places you can put them out and you won't catch a single one. If you could find a place to put your lines out and collect it and then transplant it to a grow out area, you might be able to develop that technology. But you start talking, I've had as much as 4 miles of line out in a year before, and to try to generate that amount of seed out of the wild and to have a consistent farm would really be tough. But it could be done. Yes, and that's you start small as the bottom line. Like right now, I sold my 34-foot Weber's Cove, and I'm working out of an 18-foot maritime skiff, and so I know that I can only bring in about 1,000 pounds in that. And I ride it right up on the boat trailer, all the nice coolers already iced, and I take it right to the shop. So there are different ways to move it depending what you're moving it for. You're going to find that these off-takers are going to be setting up more and more gear. I mean, I'll have a barge again. My old company, I designed a barge, and I designed a similar barge for Peter and Seth over in the Sheepscot. And you can take something as simple as a 20 to 24-foot pontoon boat, put 2 davvies on it, and it'll blow your mind how much you can harvest. And then you've got it up here too, where you've got the choice of doing a complete harvest, but at least when it's up here, it's easy to clean it, because the people that are paying $1 a pound, they want clear kelp. They want when we buy kelp, we want the good stuff. We don't want the stuff we can't market, because there's no market for it. And so to get a premium for it, you need to bring it in trimmed and in really good shape. And so a very light rig will do that. Even a single davy on a small boat, and you just do less coolers a day if you're only talking LPAs. And once you move up onto a larger scale, well, then you need to think about getting a larger boat. A big Carolina skiff with 2 davvies, you could bring in 4,000 or 5,000 pounds.
So you just haul it up and flake it down?
Yep. Well, no, you want to clear it off the line, and then you want to clear the holdfast off the line, so the line is then ready to go next year again. It's much easier to, it's easier on the kelp and easier on you to harvest it right there out on the ocean. Yeah, I like that knot and a half, 2 knot kind of area. But it changes so much with moon tides too, that you can't go to a place and say, okay, this place is always going to be the same. You get a lot of fluctuation over the course of the month. So a knot and a half, 2 knots is a real nice current. No, because if you look along the entire coastline, as it moves away from the shoreline, it balances real quick, and you're going to see an average of around 30 in most places, and you can have quite a bit of variance there. The thing you'd want to look at there, if you knew you were in a lighter nitrogen area, is you might want to not put as heavy a load in on your farms. You know, if you knew that you were in an area that was running a little bit lower on that. But you'll find out that we have hot spots in certain embayments and along certain areas, but then it comes to it really goes to an average pretty quick by the time you get even a little bit outside. But it's great that you asked that. I've been working with Gretchen Grebe. She's writing her doctoral thesis on exactly that. And we, for the last 2 or 3 years, have actually been doing microbial studies on our farms of the surrounding water and what it actually is on the kelp. And we're also working with Nicole Price up at Bigelow Labs on that. And we're having really good positive results. We're also working on the antibacterial properties. One of the what would she be, a physicist, I think, down at the University of New England. We've known all along that there are certain microbial, bacterial properties to seaweeds. It actually has its own kind of anti-fouling. And so we're finding that it's not a problem, that you can have a fairly heavy content in the water and the kelp is still really pretty clean. And if you look where we've been buying for decades now from China and where they grow it, anecdotally it sounds like it's pretty true, looks pretty true also. I'm running 3/8. Yep, I was up to 1/2 inch for a while and I kept going down, and I've been getting 3 to 5 years out of my line as long as you take care of it, you know, run through it and look at it, but I'm getting away with 3/8. You have to, what we do is we actually run we run every 200 feet. I take 2 7x14 buoys on a piece of PVC and I set the depth at 7 feet and do a concrete counterweight, and that holds it in place. Because what happens is the seaweed grows if you've got big stipes, because it's releasing oxygen. You know, it sequesters carbon, releases oxygen, it sequesters nitrogen, it sequesters phosphorus. It's really cool stuff. But the stipes, if they get big enough, become hollow, and that oxygen that it's releasing, they fill with oxygen. And so what happens first, your line sinks as it's growing, and then your line wants to float. And so we found basically the optimal buoy weight ratio to keep it real consistent at 7 feet. And then with this new system, it works even better than the old. Because of the plow anchors, you got a tag line, crown line going up on each one right straight from the anchor. You can grab it from behind on your boat, wrap it on the bow, back down and tension that thing to perfection. It fishes so well, it's unbelievable. I had trouble with my original rigs a little bit. I had good spacing on them, but like you get a real moon tide, you get a real drainer, all of a sudden you get a couple of them together and they can start getting tangled, you know, as you move into bigger, more complicated sites. And so having this new system has just been, it's been really sweet. With the plow anchor, what I do is I usually go about 1/3 of, you do the plow anchor, you've got a line coming up from the back of the plow anchor with a buoy on it, your tag line, you shackle a piece of chain. I usually use about 1/3 chain, 2/3 line for a 3-to-1 scope. That comes up to a buoy on top. And the buoy on top is just one of your regular doubled 7x14s, and so that's your first depth setter. And so you come out onto the site, you've got your anchor rigged, you kick it overboard with the tag line, you back down on your 3-to-1 scope, and now you're just backing there and just holding it with the boat just right on the bow. And so you run your line and you tie your buoys on and your counterweight on. You run your line through the piece of PVC and tie it onto the anchor rig. You tie your string onto that and then you just back down. And I'm running 200-foot rigs, 200-foot spools is what I've been running. So you back down 200 feet, you put in another set of double buoys and a counterweight. You start your next spool, you go 200 more feet, you tie into your double buoy and counterweight, and you back down your anchor rode the first 2/3, you get to the chain and the anchor, you drop it, you take your tag line, back down on it, and she's taut. Yeah, you can put them in. That was one of the many things I experimented with, was how early I could put them in. And because once again, the earlier you put them in, the earlier you can potentially harvest them, or the bigger they can be at the end of the season. So I've actually gotten them in as early as August 30th now. When I first started, the top scientist, and Charlie is really good, Charlie Yarish, Professor Yarish out of the University of Connecticut, he's been playing around with the seed forever. He's the one who helped me develop the seed technology or take it to a commercial scale. And initially we were told you can only get source tissue in September, you can only seed in late October and November. And we found out that you can take it earlier if you're in a place where you don't have conflict with the lobster gear. Main reason we set October, November was because that's when most of the lobster gear has already been pulled. In May, that's when it's ready to come out. It's going to start getting biofouled. It's not going to look as nice. So April, May is the perfect harvest time, which is before the majority of people are putting any inshore gear down. So it makes it real easy. There's nothing you have to do. What I have done in the past, and especially in the early experimentations, was made different products out of the juveniles. If you go out there and when it starts getting 3 and 5 feet long and you've got usable sporophytes, that's what you call the kind of adult plants from the time they're microscopic to 20 feet long. They're always a sporophyte. And you've got that rig I was talking about with the barge that I showed earlier. You can selectively cut the nice ones and use those and make, I was making wraps out of them. If anybody's ever had fish in papillote or fish in a brown paper bag, well, I wrap it in whole kelp leaves, and it's kelp or fish in kelpiote, and you eat the whole thing. Yeah, and so you make new product. So what I do is I make new products out of things in that situation, and then it's just, they're also just perfect. The market, the chefs are really starting to like the whole cooked sporophytes to use, and if you pick them when they're like 5 feet long, you're getting them before there's any damage to the blades, the whole blades and prime tips, so you can prime shapes, so you can get a premium for that kind of stuff. And if you selectively cut, I've done it as many as 5 times on a length of line. Well, the ones that are kind of growing slow, they just take off when they have more room. It's like the biggest ones start shading the smaller ones. So if you selectively cut down a line, you can actually get multiple harvests through 2 or 3 months. I try to go out every month because I've caught things before. I've caught trees. Trees are the biggest things. You know, you get a good moon tide and the trees start floating around. If they can snag a buoy, it can be the only buoy in 2 miles either way. That tree will find it. It's like a magnet. Funny you should ask that. I haven't dealt with the USDA since yesterday or the FDA since today. Every year the rules get stricter and stricter, and it gets harder and harder. You know, and it's just getting very onerous. And so the key is for us to make more better products so we can afford to pay people a good price for the product. I mean, I still farm and harvest most of my own myself, but that's starting to change rapidly. And with the success we've had at the last couple of food shows, and with a new company that's come into the state, I think we're going to see volume going out finally. You know, that has been the big drawback. I've had people that have wanted to grow for me for years, and I'm like, I just can't sell that much yet, or I can't produce that much yet. I just moved from an 800 square foot facility processing floor with external freezers to a 3,000 foot processing floor that's all processing. I think there's at least 5 now.
Really?
Yep.
In Maine?
In Maine. They have different profiles. Of course, Shep has been buying forever, Earhart, Maine Coast Sea Vegetables. And he's got some very, he's doing mostly wild and it's organic. So there's some restrictions on what he can take, but he's starting to work with the farmed. I believe the Maine Seaweed Exchange is buying, my old company is buying, we're buying, and Sea Greens, so is that 6? I think there's 5 or 6 companies now, and 5 years ago, there was me.
And Tollef, your company is called?
Ocean's Balance.
Okay. All right.
I didn't name the new company, my co-founder did.
All right.
Yes. Common sense would tell you that, and reality and Mother Nature would tell you that, but will Mofka tell you that? So you have to jump through some hoops, quite a few hoops to be organic. With the farming, it starts with the seed, and with the wild, it starts with the harvest area. And then there are other steps along the way. So yes, the crop is organic, but to get it certified organic is another deal. About $1,000 worth.
Is it worth it?
Probably in the long run, but like I say, it can be the added headaches, and so we probably will get, like with my kelp puree, I actually make it to the puree, and then I take it to a co-packer, and the co-packer, I could have it organic easily through what I go through, but the co-packer, the only one in the state who can do what I need done, doesn't have an organic rating, so boom, that breaks the chain right there. In theory, a study just done by the University of Maine under the CNET grant said that they see a 20% premium by having organic on the label. I question that if that's across the board, and it was a rather small sampling, and so it doesn't hurt to have organic on there, and it can boost the price, but we're not. I think all natural works really well. It's worked really well for me. The preliminary data has been just fine. We don't have we had actually done, I had earlier done a bunch of testing for heavy metals and came up with non-detectable across the board through a lab in California, of all places. It's a real strict one. The arsenic problem that people have been studying has mainly been in digitata and hijiki. Not many others have had it, and that's really been the only heavy metal that we've shown up in quantities that could be detrimental. And they took, the U.S. Organic Association took 40 samples of dried digitata, the same product, from Iceland, tested it in 40 different labs and got 40 different results. This kind of goes because there's no real baseline. What Nicole is doing now is she's establishing a real meaningful baseline, so we're actually going to have some information that will become meaningful because we'll have a starting point. I always look back to the anecdotal side of it. The societies that live in coastal communities in Japan and China have been eating it for millennia, and they aren't dropping dead from arsenic. Matter of fact, just the opposite. They have, especially Japan, I think the longest lives of any of us.
Well, that was fabulous. That's a lot of questions, a lot of interest there. Thanks again, Tom.
Thank you for the questions.